Before there were apps, before there were platforms, before a single algorithm ever decided what your time was worth, there was a handshake. There was a knock on the door, a note on the bulletin board at the feed store, and a reputation built one neighbor at a time. In the small towns of America, from roughly 1960 all the way through the early 1980s, ordinary people ran quiet little enterprises that kept families fed, bills paid, and communities stitched tightly together. Nobody called it a side hustle back then. They just called it getting by. And in many ways, it was a richer, more human economy than anything we have today. This is the story of 15 of those forgotten trades, the ones your grandparents knew, the ones that have all but vanished, and the ones that quietly shaped the backbone of small-town American life. Let's begin where so many childhood memories begin, in the living room, sitting on a bench in front of an upright piano, with a neighbor's hands guiding yours across the keys. Music lessons were one of the most common side hustles in small-town America during this era. A woman who had studied piano in her youth, or a man who had played guitar in a local band, didn't let that skill sit idle. They opened their front rooms up on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, hung a handwritten schedule on the refrigerator, and charged somewhere between $1 and $5 a lesson. For a family with children, it was affordable culture, a way to give kids something refined, something lasting. For the teacher, it was steady supplemental income that required no storefront, no license, and no advertising beyond word of mouth. These neighborhood instructors weren't just music teachers. They were community anchors who shaped the taste and discipline of entire generations in towns that had no arts programs and no music schools within 50 miles. From the living room, we moved to the driveway, and the rumble of a truck engine. In every small town during this era, there was a man with a truck. Sometimes it was a farmer between harvests. Sometimes it was a retired tradesman with time on his hands and a strong back. Whatever the case, this man, and it was almost always a man, was available for any heavy or unpleasant job that needed doing. Hauling away old appliances. Pulling stumps out of a yard. Moving furniture across town when someone's daughter got married. Cleaning out a garage that hadn't been touched since 1952. These jobs were paid in cash, and often in something even more valuable, a reputation. Once you were known as the man who showed up on time, worked hard, and didn't complain, the phone didn't stop ringing. This was the original gig economy, and it ran entirely on trust and community knowledge. Speaking of trust, let's talk about the person who was trusted with your most important memories. Before every wedding guest had a camera in their pocket, before smartphone photography democratized every moment of every life, professional photography was something you hired. And in small towns, you hired local. There was almost always someone in town, sometimes a hobbyist, sometimes a former newspaper photographer, who had a real camera, a real lens, and a darkroom set up in their basement. They showed up at weddings, at high school graduations, at anniversary parties, and at church milestones. They developed the prints themselves, often spending long quiet hours in that red-lit basement, pulling images out of chemical trays. The photos they produced were precious, often the only professional record a family would ever have of their most important days. These photographers charged modestly, worked locally, and their work still lives in shoeboxes and albums in attics all across America today. Now, from preserving memories, let's move to preserving something else entirely: furniture. Upholstery was a legitimate trade that many talented craftspeople practiced out of their garages or spare rooms during the 60s and 70s. Before the era of cheap, disposable furniture, before you could drive to a big box store and buy a sofa for $200, people repaired things. A couch that had been in the family for 20 years was worth saving. A set of dining chairs with worn-out cushions deserved to be restored. Local upholsterers were the people who made that possible. They knew their fabrics, they knew their foam, and they knew how to take apart and rebuild a piece of furniture so it looked better than it did the day it was purchased. Families saved significant money by bringing their pieces to the person on the edge of town with a garage full of fabric samples, and that person made a quiet, steady living doing work they genuinely loved. From the garage, let's step outside, all the way to the backyard, where something simple and deeply satisfying was happening. Selling farm-fresh eggs was one of the most widespread and understated side hustles of the era. In small towns and rural areas, it was completely normal for a family to keep a small flock of backyard chickens. And once your hens were laying more than your household could eat, the logical next step was to sell the surplus. Eggs went to neighbors, to people at church, to a small sign at the end of the driveway. The price was low, we're talking maybe 30 or 40 cents a dozen, but the product was genuinely superior to what was sitting on supermarket shelves. The yolks were deeper yellow, the shells were thicker, and the flavor was unmistakably fresher. Customers came back every week without fail, and the relationship between the egg seller and the buyer was warm, personal, and built on a kind of trust that no grocery store could replicate. From the backyard, let's climb into a car, because getting around was a problem that someone in every town solved quietly and without fanfare. The unofficial taxi service was an institution in small-town America, though nobody ever called it that. It was usually run by a retired man, someone with a clean car, a reliable schedule, and the kind of patience that comes with age. He drove elderly neighbors to doctor's appointments. He picked up women who didn't drive from the beauty parlor or the grocery store. He took teenagers to the next town over for a school event when their parents couldn't leave work. He charged a small fee, nothing outrageous, and he became as essential to his community as the pharmacist or the pastor. There was a dignity to this service that went beyond the economics. He was keeping his neighbors connected to the world, and his neighbors, in turn, kept him purposeful and busy in his retirement. Now let's talk about something that rang through nearly every neighborhood on a Saturday morning: the sound of a lawn mower. Yard work and lawn care as a side hustle was so common in this era that it barely registered as a business. It was simply what responsible young men and industrious neighbors did. A teenager with a push mower could earn $2 or $3 per yard, and with a half dozen regular customers, that was real money in 1968. But it wasn't just teenagers. Grown adults with the right equipment took on larger properties, offered seasonal services like leaf raking in the fall and snow shoveling in the winter, and built small but stable clienteles in their own neighborhoods. What made this side hustle work was consistency. Show up every week, do a clean job, and people would rather pay you than deal with it themselves. That bargain has existed in one form or another since people first planted grass, but in small-town America during this era, it was everywhere. Let's step inside again, this time to a quieter room, where someone was bent over a sewing machine. Sewing and alterations was another trade that lived in kitchens and spare bedrooms all over small-town America. Women, and yes, it was predominantly women, who had grown up sewing their own clothes and their children's clothes discovered that their neighbors were more than happy to pay for their skill. Hemming a pair of trousers, taking in a dress for a special occasion, repairing a zipper, letting out a seam, these were small jobs that most people didn't know how to do and didn't want to learn. A woman with a good sewing machine and a steady hand could build up a loyal clientele that kept her busy and brought in meaningful supplemental income. Some took it further, making custom curtains, quilts for sale, or even simple garments on request. In an era when clothes were still worth repairing, the neighborhood seamstress was genuinely indispensable. From the sewing room, let's head to the kitchen, because what came out of those kitchens was something people lined up to buy. Home canning and the sale of preserves, jams, jellies, and pickles was a deeply rooted tradition in small-town America that blurred the line between homemaking and enterprise. Women who put up their own food every summer, peaches, tomatoes, green beans, strawberry jam, often made more than their families could use in a year. The surplus found its way to neighbors, to church fundraisers, and to little tables set up at the end of driveways. The jars were modest, the labels often handwritten, and the prices were never high. But the product was exceptional. A jar of homemade blackberry preserves from the woman down the road was something you couldn't buy in any store, and people knew it. This side hustle required no special equipment beyond what every farmhouse kitchen already had, and it generated real income from work that was already being done. Now let's talk about someone who kept the modern world running in an era when the modern world was still figuring itself out. Television and appliance repair was one of the most valuable small-town side hustles of the 1960s and 1970s, and the people who did it were treated almost like wizards. When the TV went out the night before a big game, or the washing machine stopped spinning with a full load inside, you didn't call a national service center, you called the man in town who knew how to fix things. Many of these repairmen learned their trade in the military, or through correspondence courses, or simply by taking things apart until they understood them. They set up modest shops in garages or basements, charged fair rates, and kept every appliance in town running for years past its expected lifespan. In a world before everything became disposable, their skills were not just useful, they were essential. From fixing machines, let's talk about fixing something we all walk on. Shoe repair is a trade that feels almost mythological today, but in small-town America during this era, it was a practical necessity. A good pair of leather shoes or work boots was an investment, and when the sole wore through or the heel broke down, you took them to be fixed rather than replaced. Some towns had dedicated cobblers with storefronts, but in many places, shoe repair was a side hustle run out of someone's home. The person who did it had a lasting machine, a selection of leather and rubber soles, and hands that knew how to work with tough materials. Farmers brought their boots. Businessmen brought their dress shoes. And every single job was a transaction built on the understanding that things were worth maintaining, worth preserving, worth fixing rather than throwing away. And while we're talking about things that needed maintaining, let's talk about blades. Knife sharpening and tool maintenance was a traveling trade that passed through small towns on a reliable circuit. The sharpener might come through once a month with a grinding wheel mounted in a van or on a bicycle, ringing a bell as they moved through neighborhoods. But in many towns, someone local had set up a small operation in their garage and did the same work on a stationary basis. Kitchen knives, scissors, garden shears, lawn mower blades, wood chisels, anything with an edge that needed restoring came through the door. It was satisfying, precise work, and customers were grateful in a way that felt immediate and genuine. A sharp knife in a home kitchen was the difference between a chore and a pleasure, and the person who provided that service was always welcomed back. From sharpening minds, well, in a manner of speaking, let's talk about one more way that knowledge was quietly monetized in small-town America. Tutoring and academic help was a side hustle that didn't always look like one. A retired school teacher who helped neighborhood children with their homework for a few dollars a week. A college student home for the summer who coached the neighbor kid through algebra. A woman who was known to have a gift for reading and grammar who sat with struggling students around her kitchen table. These arrangements were informal, personal, and often transformative. In towns without learning centers, without after-school programs, without educational apps or online resources, the smart neighbor who was willing to teach was one of the most valuable people around. Many students who went on to real academic success owe a quiet debt to someone who helped them over a stumbling block in a small-town kitchen during these decades. And finally, let's end where so many cold winter mornings began, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a chainsaw in the distance. Firewood cutting and selling was as straightforward a side hustle as has ever existed, and it was absolutely everywhere in small-town America during the 1960s through the 1980s. A man with access to wooded land, his own or a neighbor's, often worked in exchange for the wood itself, could spend his autumn weekends cutting, splitting, and stacking. By the time the first freeze came, he was selling cords of wood to every household in the area that had a fireplace or a wood stove. This was not glamorous work. It was hard, physical, and sometimes dangerous. But it was honest, and it was always in demand. Heating oil prices spiked through the 1970s, and a reliable source of good dry firewood was something people depended on. The man who provided it was doing something real, something tangible, something the community genuinely needed. And that, perhaps, is the thread that runs through all 15 of these forgotten side hustles. They were real. They were tangible. They filled genuine needs in communities where neighbors knew each other by name, where a reputation took years to build and seconds to lose, and where the idea of earning extra money was inseparable from the idea of being useful to the people around you. We live in a different world now. The digital economy has created extraordinary new opportunities, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But something was also lost when we moved from the age of the handshake to the age of the algorithm. Something human. Something local. Something that looked your neighbor in the eye and said, "I can help with that." These 15 side hustles remind us of a time when the economy was, in a very real sense, something you could touch. Something built from skill, from trust, from showing up and doing the work. And even if the trades themselves have mostly faded away, the spirit behind them, the entrepreneurial, community-minded, quietly industrious spirit of small-town America, that hasn't gone anywhere at all. It's still there, waiting to be remembered.